Warm welcome to all of you to our interdisciplinary conference, Manufacturing Collectivity, Exploring the Nexus of Gender, Collectivities and Law. My name is Beate Binder. I'm professor for European Ethnology and Gender Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. And today I welcome you as speaker of our research unit, Gender, Law, Collectivity, and of course, in the name of all of members of our group. Our research is funded by the DFG, the German Funding Society, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, as a collaborative effort. And to put it briefly, our work is grounded in the very idea that together you see more. Our interdisciplinary research group is based at the three Berlin universities, the Free University, Technical University, and Humboldt University, at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder, and the University of Potsdam. We come from a variety of disciplines, from history, sociology, administrative studies, law, European ethnology, and we have met in what we understand to be and is practiced in Berlin as the transdisciplinary field of gender studies. The research group has a common theme, the interplay of law, gender, and the collective, and pursues several theoretical empirical projects, from struggles for law to institutional change induced by law, from negotiating norms of how we live together to struggles in court on who is allowed to live in a given country legally at all. Yet overall, our research seeks to acknowledge and critically reflect from an interdisciplinary perspective and based in intersectional gender studies, the pivotal role law is playing in current political conflicts of coexistence, belonging, and participation. With this conference, we invite you to join a conversation, our conversation. We hope to critically discuss the nexus of gender, collectivities, and law. Manufacturing collectivity, who does it, when is it done, how and what comes off in doing so. We assume that late modern societies are characterized by dynamic conflicts that challenge social cohesion. But what happens then? What future aspirations are contained in these conflicts? We also assume that these conflicts do not only reject or seek to destroy, but also contribute to the emergence of refiguration of collectivity and the collective, of concepts and understandings of the common, of common goods, of solidarity, and so on. And we want to know how that works. This conference was planned to take place in early summer 2020. It was postponed because of the pandemic. Thus, a midterm conference turned into a conference bridging the first and the second period of funding our research group. It is only some weeks ago that we received the grant for another 3 years. For us, the conference is now an end and a beginning, and we are really happy about that. Now, my dear colleague and co-speaker, Susanne Beer, currently Justice of the German Federal Constitutional Court, but also Professor for Public Law and Gender Studies at Humboldt University, will join me in welcoming you. And in the following, we will try to briefly dive into the context of manufacturing collectivities to give you an idea of where the research group comes from and the aim of this conference and our future plans.
Welcome from me as well. We are very happy to have this conference despite the fact that it's in virtual mode, but we are very happy to meet in our transdisciplinary setting to discuss how collectivities are manufactured. So how do we approach these topics? How do we combine law, gender, and our interest in collectivities in our work. And I myself, certainly as a justice and law professor, work with the law. So I start with the law, study the law, apply the law. But what is that really exactly, and in this research group? In our collaboration, we start with an understanding of law that is rather familiar to what is now called interdisciplinary legal studies. In German-speaking contexts, the long tradition of law and sociology, rechtssoziologische Forschung, and this has always been a critical approach to law. Most prominently, feminist legal studies on gender and law, certainly with an eye on intersectionality or the multidimensionality of inequalities law has to address. Queer legal studies, critical race and post-colonial legal studies, and more if needed, are our starting kind of frame of mind. So when we say that, what is law then really? Law is often treated by lawyers in legalese as a body of rules and decisions, doctrinal, juridical, purely and formally legal. From a critical point of view, this is certainly not enough. In fact, this has often been characterized as the oppressive nature of the law, state power, if not hegemony. However, this is certainly a rather limited point of view. Now, our research group argues not to forget about it, but to take that juridical, legally, formalistic nature of law seriously, but add additional perspectives when we look at the law. So Rechtsoziologie, or law and society studies, and critical legal studies have set out to emphasize that law is problematic as doctrine, as legalese, as juridical, with its formalism and with its power. And you do need, as a lawyer, sociology, political science, and more to see that. So interdisciplinary work on law already has a benefit because it expands our vision on what the law is. This perspective then emphasizes the nature and effect of law. It pays attention to the details, i.e. regarding legal institutions or institutional design. It pays attention to the processes and the procedure in which law is mobilized, acted out, performed. However, then, this critical perspective, already added to the purely legalistic perspective, is still not enough, we think, to understand the law in its full kind of formation. So radical feminist legal studies describe law, in addition to what I just said, as a performative practice that creates its own ontology. Namely, that law establishes and perpetuates an essentialist concept of heterosexualized gender. So you need serious gender studies to understand that, in addition to what is already on the table. As such, on the basis of that, with that perspective, legal gender studies start from life, not law, and integrate social, historical, and ethnographic perspectives. But again, one approach, and not even that wonderful approach, or one angle, is not enough to fully grasp what happens when law is on stage. So what we think is that we need to understand that law is not only the powerful tool out there, state power, repressive, etc., but that law also has this productive side, this emancipatory side, this liberating side, that law cracks the wall of dominance. Law then is not just oppressive, but also productive, is not just prohibitive, but also an incentive, is not only closure, but also an opening or a participatory mode, etc. Therefore, in our collaboration, we look at law broadly and combine these findings. In our research then, looking at specific fields, practices, emanations, we try to systematically look at law from these varieties of angles and confront the limitations of one with the expansions of the other, and vice versa. Thus, we do not predefine the law out there and then look at what happens when it's applied or when a court renders a judgment or something like that. Rather, we seek to understand what law, either as legislation or as a court ruling or as a doctrine or as a legal claim by somebody on the street or in politics or as legalistic discourse is and does in various contexts and processes, namely in social conflicts. That is the focus. What is law doing? What happens? What is law in social conflicts when gender and collectivities are reconfigured? Put a little differently, our research takes law seriously as statute, treaty, ruling, doctrine created in very specific ways. It's not just another norm. Law has its specific features. It's applied in specific proceedings. It has distinct effects. Yet we try not to fall for a legalistic and thus limited bias. We try to understand what happens when law is handled, thus mobilized, activated, put into action by different actors, courts and lawyers that may make a difference, parliaments and administration, social movements and activists, the media, and last not least, individuals in daily life. Yet we also try not to see every reference to some normative claim as the law. We want to understand what makes a legalistic reference, a normative claim, a legal claim, but not limit legal to law in the very narrow sense. So we look at law not just as a body of rules, and specifically not as a static body of rules, like in a book of law or a statutory printout, but as a process, as something that develops, something that moves. And so we look at law as a moving body in iterative ways. It moves by steps, by court decisions, by legislative decisions, etc., etc. As one example, then, one may understand processes around law as negotiations, as verhandeln, in court, politics, on the street, at work, at home. We'll see. We're still into discussing what would be the most adequate concept to grasp what we're looking at. And in the first 3 years of our collaboration, we explored several fields. And I want to briefly point to 3 of our projects to exemplify a little bit what we found and where we are in our work there. So one project deals with courts, which is kind of a natural and prime and maybe already paradigmatic side of where law happens. So it studies how courts negotiate, in our case, gender and sexuality, and in that project, in the law of asylum, migration, refugees. So we are interested in what happens there really. This team then studied cases in European highest courts to understand how gender is reconfigured in such proceedings. At the border, to negotiate the right of asylum to protect you from persecution as gay, lesbian, trans, or otherwise deviant woman also means to negotiate who we are to allow someone in. Thus, gender and the classic national collective are on the stage at the same time. Yet when they are brought to court and queer people claim a right to asylum, everything starts moving. The classic paradigmatically male refugee becomes another being. The also somewhat classic paradigmatic female victim must be reshaped to capture LGBTIQ people in those settings. And the big we, the nation state, is already referring to a grander we, which is Europe or the international conventions that govern the field. So everything kind of starts shifting. And we want to understand, and we studied in this project, what exactly happens there, and shed light on the complex mix of in and exclusion, of old and new forms of gendered legal subjects, of collectivity deeply intertwined. But however, such developments are not limited to the real juridical sides, courts and cases and court rulings. In another project then, Maya Appel and her team studied what law does to an organization, and the other way around, what the organization does to a law. This group picked a state organization often deemed very far from topics like gender, queer, LGBT rights, anti-discrimination, etc., the Bundeswehr, the German military. What happens in such a traditionally male organization when law has to be implemented that prohibits sex discrimination, that calls for an opening of our concepts of gender, that wants to introduce new subjectivities? What is law in this process? We saw that new collectives emerge around agendas set by law. But now in this research, we're interested in how gender is reconfigured and whether and how collectives change. And to name a third example, Martin Lücke and his team set out to understand such processes over time. Martin Lücke comes from history, and so this group studied the history of the gay rights movement. In Germany, as in many other contexts, this movement is initially rallied against the criminalization of gay sex. The whole point of the movement was a law, the criminal prohibition of gay sex. Eventually then, during the AIDS pandemic, the gay rights movement wanted legal recognition of certain rights in this crisis. And later, the gay rights movement was a movement to get legal recognition as couples in gay marriage. So what does law do to the ability or options of this movement to re-envision gender? What does law do, and what do these configurations of gender do to the notions of the collective and the collectivities they invoke? In this project, it's neither courts nor a state actor administration, but a social movement and activists we are interested in how they do modify, use, reshape, redefine, mobilize the law by using it. What does this to activism and to the law? What vision of collectivity drives this? Again, law as statute, court ruling, police practice, law as the promise of equality, the protection against discrimination. Law comes from both sides or from many sides and needs to be understood in this complex setting. Hopefully, this illustrates a little bit what the focus of our research group is and what we are interested in. Again, the focus is gender from a critical perspective, the formations, the practices and concepts of the collective, implicated, intricated, intertwined with law, broadly speaking, as a variety of institutionalized practices out there. To grasp all of this, you need more than one discipline, that's for sure, and you also need more than one mind. So this is why my dear colleague Beate Binder will now expand our vision a little further.
Thank you. As already became clear, law, broadly speaking, is more than a statute or a ruling. Even more radically, and one may approach the whole field from the other side, namely from social or cultural practices. I prefer social practices, to be honest. This is the angle on the law of cultural anthropology and social studies as well. They look from that what people are doing in the first place. With its interest in the politics and poetics of the everyday, cultural anthropology aims at understanding the configurations of life worlds and social situations, with law playing an important but not always looked at part in framing, stabilizing, and structuring these configurations. But again, this is a question: in which way does law this do? It's not the prefiguring, but it's as Susanne already said, it's a moving something you can't know what is happening in certain situations with law and to law. Here, this is for sure, law doesn't start on the books, but as a social life, and is first and foremost articulated and in social practices. From this perspective, law is restricting and enabling a force that people have to navigate with in their everyday lives, for sure. To look at the social life of law offers several additional insights. Notably, we seek to understand the strategies and tactics of dealing with rules and regulations, making use of them for one's own purposes, for one's group's purposes, protesting against or for them. Last but not least, acting beyond the borders of the legitimate and allowed. In context, such studies look at the way the law, or even broader, the legal complex, is entangled with politics, bureaucratic processes, and the restructuring of ethical principles and morality. Law turns out to be an uneven process with unexpected effects during its implementation and its lifelong being. In fact, I'm most interested in the moments of closure that every legal frame or procedure brings with it, in that every decision for a specific framing allows for and restricts articulation and acting simultaneously. Here, anthropology meets legal gender studies and critical legal theory. Law enables and restricts, and we seek to understand how this happens and what happens exactly in these situations, to see the possibilities law offers and the price to pay in these very moments where we relate to law. Therefore, when we set out to manufacturing collectivity, we see the social life of law always closely connected to processes of collectivization. Such processes are sometimes induced by law in its force of implementing categories, yet collectives organize themselves as well to oppose the law or to fight for law to change. What are the effects of the invocation of law? In social science and legal anthropology, work on juridification addresses what happens to social negotiations when these struggles are taken to court on a regular basis, or to parliament to be regulated and solved with legal responses. We want to understand better how to deal with the normativity of a legal system, highly gendered as well as racialized from its very beginning. Moreover, we want to find out how social practices in this field of legal struggles take part in reshaping gender, race, and class, and so on. Now, how does this work? The team working with me looked on anti-discrimination law and more precisely at the implementation of the Bundesteilhabegesetz, a federal statute to regulate participation of disabled people, intended to fight discrimination and exclusion. Legal studies help to understand the legal context, procedural requirements, shift in terminology, doctrinal meaning of this law or this statute. The anthropological perspective and the ethnographic research allows us to follow those actors involved in the process to translate law in bureaucratic procedures and thus in the everyday of lots of people. It allows looking at on those engaged in social movements and the changing of infrastructures and bureaucratic organization. This perspective moves law from the courts to public administration, but beyond that to activists and the legal subjects of such law in life. As another example, Eva Kocher and her team studied crowd workers, new types of work, a challenge to old structures of labor law, including collective norms of unions, and maybe a challenge to traditionally masculine subjectivities, as well as to practices and norms of the collective, namely solidarity. With legal expertise, we can grasp the law. With law broadly understood, we seek to understand normativity in various dimensions. And with an ethnographic angle, it is possible to grasp the practices at hand, the aspirations of those trying to better their working conditions collectively. These practices in everyday life are also the focus of another project, Housing Commons. Here, Sabine Haag, Hannah Meissner, and their team ask how in such co-housing projects, law and gender configure and help to give life to a new way of quotation commonality, of everyday commonality. Focusing on current debates around commons, it becomes obvious that law is only one player in a collectivizing process. Nevertheless, the members of housing collectives are forced to provide their project with a legal framework, which then shapes the newly found forms of cohabitation and solidarity.
So we are out to better understand how we figure out to live together. The housing project, the research project on the commons hopefully makes that very clear, but all our projects have that broader, huge question in mind. Under conditions of enforced globalization, the normalization of migration, and the dissolution of the national as a powerful point of reference, we wonder what norms we, people in their everyday lives, create now. In the 3 years to come, then, this is the central focus, something which was in the back of our minds now moved to center stage. What is this we, all, the new general, das Allgemeine? Still, we are interested in how social conflicts manifest themselves. Collectives are important generators of impulse in the social negotiations of community, common good, and solidarity. So these collectives engaged or active in social conflicts are still our starting point. In the second funding phase, we try to expose processes of collectivization and ask again about the role of law and gender in these processes. Regarding gender, in which way exactly does gender as an intersectional mode of socialization affect negotiations of the commons, the collectives, and solidarity? How do notions of gender and sexuality intervene in plans and aspirations for the future? Or regarding the law, what is the role of law in these social conflicts and struggles? How does law intervene and frame as a mobilizing agent, as a restricting or an enabling force, as a hegemonic tool, or something more open, more flexible? And regarding collectivities, all our projects focus on conflictual negotiations of the general, as well as practices and imaginaries of the common. We look, if you want, at real-time experiments that seek new forms of social solidarity and social cohesions. We are interested what people do in the context of law, gender, and collectivity out there to find out how we will act in societies in the future. We suspect that there's something there worth studying. As such, we will look at climate litigation. We will also look at transnational value chains and labor migration. We want to study practices and conflicts of commoning in urban and housing commons. And we want to study initiatives of the lesbian and gay movement on human rights and human rights education. We also look at consumer protection as well as infrastructure processes in transportation planning and obstetrics. Again, in all these projects, the starting question remains, how do gender, law, and collectivity figure there and are reconfigured in the broad context of what exactly is that vision people develop for our future? And for this conference, the key question thus somewhat emerges: how are collectivities manufactured?
Okay, so far is that what have been our doings and what are our plans, our thoughts, what we think is worth doing for the next year and years, and we are so happy that we are able to continue our work. But for today, it's now time to move on in our program, and I will right away introduce our keynote speaker, Emily Crabham, who we are very happy that she followed our invitation.